can just hit switch displays at the top.
This is what I want. Better?
Yes. This works fine. So it's 4:30. I'll let Paul begin his talk.
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks to John for inviting me to this. And I took his injunction very seriously about talking about what's sort of recently interesting. I'm using this as an opportunity to actually show you guys my, my quarantine programming project for the last couple months. So it'll be lighthearted, a lot of videos, not a lot of heavy math, and hopefully some fun. So let's jump right into it. The goal of the project is to develop a computational theory of what sits underneath intentional action, which is of course a very important topic if you're building agents or claim to be building agents. Why do it? Well, because there's a lot of work on intentions that's been done in AI, but intentional action is a little bit different because, as we'll see, intentions can come apart from intentional action. And there's something that mediates the relationship between the two. It's usually kind of talked about in terms of agentive control, but we also think that agency is deeply involved there. And that's kind of our contribution, is to really look at this intention issue from the perspective of an attention-centric architecture. Okay, so hopefully this is the only real big dense slide. We'll see it again as we go on, just to show that we've made some progress along the way, but fundamentally defined intentions are something like commitments to future actions, making them different from simple goals or desires or even considered plans. After all, you can have 3 or 4 different plans in mind to get from where you are to where you want to be, but you only pick one of them and intend to go that way and kind of comport yourself so that you go that way. There are a lot of proposals, mostly made by philosophers, more recently by psychologists and neuroscientists, about the structure and function of intentions. Traditionally in philosophy and in BDI model, intentions were viewed as sort of plans. They allow you to cache deliberation about what to do in the future. So if you intend to go to the store in the future, rather than do X, Y, or Z other things, you no longer have to think anymore about X, Y, or Z. And when you get to the point where you go to the store, you don't have to divert any kind of cognitive resources to work that choice out. If you set an intention to do something in the future, you can use that to kind of stably set some other intention that follows from that, which is nice. Intentions in some sense also stabilize activities, so that if you choose to do something, if you resolve to do something, as you're going along towards achieving that thing, other opportunities may come up, but the intention kind of discounts the possibility of you adopting some other intention that would interfere or terminate the first one. That doesn't always work, of course. People have weakness of the will and other things, but that's theoretically something that intentions do. I won't talk in this talk at all really about intentions as beliefs, but intentions come usually with something like self-knowledge about what's being done. So when you're making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you usually know that you're doing that. You're aware that you're doing that. And that's important in various ways, as we'll see, to intentional action. The view that's sort of most influenced this talk, and it's a very new view, is intentions at some level or another are kind of controllers. So intentions are arranged hierarchically from very abstract kind of action descriptions, like, for example, to drive to the store, the supermarket, or something like that, to plan instances, or those are other forms of intention. So you can take route A, route B, and route C that you know, to parameterized motor plans. So once one of those plan instances is in place and you've adopted one of those intentions, that influences motor plans and perception. And by being arranged hierarchically, you have error that can be propagated up from one level to another. So changes that need to be made at the bottom may affect something in your plan instance. If you find that there's constraints on motor behavior that make a certain plan instance infeasible, you may have to drop that one and readopt some other one. And then if there's something that makes all of those plan instances infeasible, it may be the case that you have to change your high-level goal, and so on. So the big thing here is that intentions partially consist, for us at least, in monitoring and control mechanisms, we'll see that later, that propagate those error signals up and down the hierarchy. The The view kind of assumes that most behavior is automatic. So when you're sort of driving along in your car, there's not a whole lot of deliberation while you're doing the driving, especially if you're on a route that you've been down before a bunch of times. But it is interruptible and it is subject to intentional control under certain conditions. Intentions direct attention to task-relevant aspects of the world. We'll see that throughout the talk, so I'm not going to kind of perseverate on it here. The important thing for intentional control is that intentions themselves must be routinely attended and maintained in the face of distraction. If you're doing more than, if you think about texting and driving, for example, you have to constantly go back and remonitor the road, or else something bad may happen, right? So you need to kind of deliberatively make sure that you're constantly kind of maintaining your attention, your intentions, so that they can do their job of directing attention to task relevant aspects of the world, and you can succeed at what you're doing. Okay, so we have built an architecture over a number of years now, 5 or 6 years, called Arcadia. It's attention centric, and all I'm really going to say about it is that it's a set of distributed components. The components can have arbitrary guts inside of them, neural networks, rules, whatever you want. They're wrapped in something called interlingua that allows for communication between components. And what facilitates that communication are attentional priorities. And as we'll see, attentional priorities are embedded in task representations. So when you adopt a new task, that comes along with a set of attentional priorities that help you, that kind of attune you to aspects of that task to find in the world or in inner space in the mind. It's not necessarily that attention can only be directed outwards in this case. And those priorities help you select the output of those components that happen every 20 milliseconds that are most sort of task relevant. So you pick a focus of attention, and that focus of attention is broadcast on the next cycle to all components. So your task ends up coordinating the behavior of all of these sort of distributed components over time. And here's kind of just a view of that at some level or another. You see that there's active maintenance of tasks over there in the upper right-hand corner. And really the core message that I'm trying to get across here before we get into the meat of the talk is that you have actively maintained tasks. Inside of those tasks, you have these attentional priorities. They affect focus. Whatever gets focused on, of course, gets broadcast to the components, and the loop continues and continues. So what intentions do on this view is that they wrap tasks up. They extend the version of, they kind of extend the representation of tasks that we had before. And they serve as kind of a control element to what before didn't really have one. Okay, just to show that idea at work, you're going to see the same video twice. It's exactly the same video, except for you'll see two different Arcadia models here that have two different tasks. So the first task is really just find me anything new. And you'll see that in the lower right-hand corner, there's salience being computed. Objects are being put together and put in visual short-term memory. And you see both that the circle and the star are picked up because the system is just looking for anything kind of new. It doesn't really care. I should mention that all of our models go directly from pixels all the way up through reasoning. So we have sort of a full pipeline for that. Okay, on the right-hand side, same video, but now you're asked to, the system is asked to count the number of times the ball changes colors, right? So exactly the same input. Here comes the star, but this time you'll notice the star doesn't end up anywhere in short-term visual short-term memory. It's the system's effectively inattentionally blind at this point. So it's so busy counting the number of times the ball changes colors that it doesn't have attentional resources to devote to picking up the star and processing it. So it just kind of goes to show you that changes in task really do make a difference to what you end up seeing in the world. So old stuff, we had something called task sets. This is not just a simple representation of like a plan or something like that. A task set comes along with a set of stimulus response rules. So you can effectively think about those things as a form of procedural knowledge. They can be they're effectively production rules, but are much richer representationally. We don't restrict them. But also every task comes along with its own set of attentional priorities, as we've been discussing. And those determine which stimuli drive behavior. So curiously, no intentions anywhere in sight. We're getting there. Okay, here's just an example to show you that intentions come apart from intentional action. So on the right, there's Ralph. Ralph is angry because he's found out that his uncle, who he's been taking care of, his sick uncle who's been taken care of, has cut him out of his will. So he gets really angry, gets a gun, puts it in his car, gets in his car and drives off like a maniac to his uncle's house with the intention to kill his uncle. And as he's driving, he's distracted by all these kind of mental images that he has about what he's going to do when he gets there. And then thud. He stops the car, gets out of the car, and sees that he's run over a pedestrian. But wouldn't you know it, he's actually run over his uncle. So the question becomes, did he run over his uncle intentionally? He had an intention to kill his uncle. But nobody really thinks he ran him over intentionally because he intended to shoot him. So he basically killed him in the wrong way at some level or another. And the reason he killed him in the wrong way is because he effectively just wasn't aware that that was his uncle at all. So part of the intentional action story is making sure that your attentional priorities are such that they're satisfied by things in the world. You pick out the right stuff by things in the world. If you're going to kill a particular target, then you have to identify the target. If you haven't identified the target, then it can't be the case that you've satisfied the description of killing, at least in the normal sense. So we actually spent some time about it, like very, very early last year, modeling this. Here's kind of a task level representation of what that looks like. There's an intention to, in this case, drive to your aunt's home and kill her. And to do that, you have to drive. Sometimes you have to recover if you drift too far off into the middle of the lane. You can ruminate, which is something that that's the problematic part of all of this, of course. But if it turns out that you see your uncle on the road or your aunt on the road, you can also adopt the intention to run over that person. So you can drop your intention to shoot her and then decide that you're just going to run her over instead. So here's the system doing that. Pache Frank, this is not a nonviolent driving simulation.
I could shoot her.
This is the unintentional case. You'll see a little dot on the bottom. That's something that you get without attention. It's just sort of a
I am going to be rich.
general spatial marker. But you'll also
I am so poor. My aunt has so much money.
There's the pedestrian. So all attention is on inner speech.
I could drown her.
There's nothing in VSTM or visual short-term memory. And because there's so much concentration on visual speech, nothing is seen. And the system ends up running over the pedestrian.
Someone call 911.
Okay. So
I could drown her.
Here's the intentional case. And what you'll see is that the model will drift off,
so poor.
Realize that it's in the middle of the lane and say, oh, I got to drive again. And as soon as it adopts the drive task, now it has drive attentional strategies. And now it's seeing things, it's monitoring for signs and pedestrians. And it picks up the pedestrian this time, recognizes it as the end and says, oh, I can just kill her instead. So puts a targeted dot on her and uses that to drive the car directly
Serves the miser right.
into her. Right. So that's sort of a retrospective. The first video you start off driving to the aunt's home, you get to ruminating, the driving gets disturbed due to emotional content. That near point at the bottom is generated to kind of drive sort of automatically, but not very well. Attention is on the sub-vocalized sort of stuff coming out of rumination, and the car ends up careening into the pedestrian. But on the second video, you're doing the same stuff, but detection of lane keeping violation is something that captures attention, and that capture is used to switch to back to driving. You recover your lane position, generate a far point to stabilize your steering. So that's attention based, along with the near point that's not. When you start fixating to task relevant objects, cars, pedestrians, and so on, you identify your ant, adopt an intention to kill her, put the far point on your ant, and guide the target, guide the car to the target. So interestingly, the way that we do control in this case is by having something like a lane keeping violation grab attention and pull you back on task. But normally what you would do is you would detect yourself ruminating too much and control that. So that's where control of attention to resist that distraction would normally do some work. We just unfortunately don't have an account of that yet. You'll see that's in our list of to-dos. Right, so out of this big list here, you see that we've made some progress on intentions, directing attention to task relevant aspects of the world. When you pop back into that drive task, all of a sudden you see driving related things happen. So you pick up cars, you pick up traffic signs and so on. In some sense or another, there's automatic behavior because you can drive without necessarily attending, as we've seen. And it's only subject to intentional control when you have some task that makes it so, which again, you've seen. But that's not necessarily something that's kind of perfected in the system. We're gonna have lots of work to do on that. So here's some really, really new stuff. We've added task hierarchy into the system. It's not exactly HTN or hierarchical task network stuff. But what you'll see here is that you have every task has something called a completion condition. Those are those blue circles, and also has some preconditions to drop down into to basically traverse into other tasks. Certainly one thing that's very different than those other representations is that you'll see if you go from wait 2, which is all the way at the bottom there, all the way back up to kill uncle, what you have is a way to pop out from the bottom of the hierarchy back up to the top of the hierarchy if it turns out the task becomes useless to do anymore for some reason. If there's some reason to drop it that doesn't have to do with it being unachievable, or I'm sorry, that doesn't have to do with it being achieved, you can kind of arbitrarily traverse, which is nice. So in this case, what you'll see is we start driving, see our uncle, decide that we're going to go kill the uncle. But then we see a witness in the scene, so we adopt a task of killing the witness. And if we've killed the witness, then we can go back to killing the uncle. But then if we see police officers, then we have to sort of wait until the police are gone or something like that, and then go back to killing the uncle. So you'll see some kind of perseveration, even though the aim of the original behavior keeps getting frustrated by various environmental conditions. So B is us, W is the witness, the cop goes away, so now the B can go kill the witness. And this is using this new representation. So the witness is now gone. It turns to going to kill the uncle, who's down in the lower left. But then all of a sudden the cop shows up, so now I've got to keep my nose clean and just drive till the cop goes away. Okay, now the cop's gone away and I can go kill the uncle. In the interest of time, I'm not gonna let that go on. So this adds a little bit to what I just discussed earlier by allowing us to start thinking about intentions and tasks hierarchically from high-level descriptions downward. And because we're operating over task hierarchies, when we intend some action within a task hierarchy, we know based on the task schema what we can do in the future, what choices we'll have in the future, and we're able to intend those as well. So now we're able to anchor some of our future choices. Okay, so this is really sort of what I've been doing recently. We've been interested in driving more generally. These are the kind of task sets that you saw before. There's a task name, a series of SR links, although you'll see that these kind of bits of procedural knowledge have things like task switching associated with them to drop into other tasks, but also have conditions under which intentions are formed. So if I see, for example, a red light in my lane, which of course is hard to determine in the first place because there may be a number of red lights in the scene, most of which are irrelevant to you. There may even be one kind of in your lane, but behind the one that's of interest to you. So you have to be able to get at that stuff too. And you would form an intention to brake, do a bunch of computations to kind of figure out when you think you ought to start braking, and get that intention kind of in place. So we've looked at braking for targets, and then once you've braked, once you've been successful at braking, then you have to wait for the green light, which means attention has to be focused again on the light's state, periodically looking for when it turns green, and when it does, then you get to switch back to driving again. When you're driving, you also get to see speed limits. So then you form intentions to drive that new speed limit. And this process is actually kind of feeds on itself, because if you see one speed limit sign, you speed up or slow down, and then you see another one, you have to dump the old intention, adopt the new intention, and sort of keep going that way. So what have we added to the representation of intentions? So intentions can be of two forms, just like goals can be of two forms. They're kind of like achievement intentions. And we'll see that braking is one of those sorts of things. You develop an intention to brake, and you've either been successful at that or not. But other stuff like following the speed limit is kind of a maintenance sort of goal or maintenance intention, where yes, you drive the speed limit, and yes, you may get up to the speed limit, but what you don't want to do is you want to kind of continuously monitor that to make sure that you're doing that. So all of these intentions have activation conditions, termination conditions, and satisfaction conditions that are monitored on every cycle. When you activate an intention, so you typically form an intention far before you have to activate it, which is kind of an interesting thing. That means you can really deliberate, you really save yourself deliberation in the future. Way before you need to brake, you think to yourself, oh, I'm going to have to brake, probably. If you have an achievement intention for an activated, if you have an activated intention, I'm sorry, the intentions come in two states. They're either maintained or activated. So you may form one and it's not activated yet. And those kinds of intentions are called maintained intentions. So we're just kind of maintaining them until their activation conditions are met, in which case they become active and they start guiding your behavior. So if you have an active intention and it's terminated, then you want to remove it from the set of intentions that you have. Or if it's satisfied, you want to remove it from the set of intentions that you have. But if it's a maintenance intention and that becomes satisfied, you don't want to remove it necessarily. So you don't want to just not go the speed limit anymore because you've hit, 60 miles an hour. You want to continue monitoring, like I said before. So let's just see this kind of all at work. This is intention formation and management through monitoring. If you look at the lower left, subvocalization content, that's the task that the system is currently in. There's objects and visual short-term memory and some intentions. So now we formed an intention to brake, but the light turns green, so we drop it. That's part of the termination conditions. Here's a green light. We never have to form an intention because it's not red. Come on. Here's a red light. So now we have to brake for the target. We slow down, we brake. Now we go and wait for green light. It turns green. Now we drive again. So it goes through that sequence. We're going to do that one more time. Now we see a speed limit sign. It says go 60. System will speed up. Now it sees another one. It replaces that first one, go 30, and it slows down. And that's where my waypoint stops. So Right, so the formation process for these things for like braking is determining when I should start stopping, populating preconditions. We need to go out to memory to find the satisfaction conditions, the termination conditions for traffic light specific actions, instantiate those schemas. The activation conditions are fairly simple. It just takes the distance from the car to the light, and then it uses that and the vehicle's current speed to compute stopping distance, or when the vehicle should start stopping, when I should start braking. And I'm sorry about the choppiness on the driving. That's me not tuning the PID control stuff that's going on with actuation in the model. So the satisfaction conditions for braking is the car is stopped in the right position relative to the light. It's within some epsilon distance, and the light's still red. If the light turned green, then of course we could throw this intention away. It doesn't make a difference anymore.
Paul, you have about 4 minutes left.
Okay, I'm almost done. Right, and the termination conditions, we saw the light turns green, the car passes the threshold, the epsilon distance threshold. In other words, the car rolls up to the light but goes too far, and once you've gone too far, you have to drop the intention and continue to go, because if you don't, then you're going to keep braking and you're going to find yourself in the middle of an intersection just stopped, which is something that happened a number of times while I was coding this stuff up. Speed limits are the same kind of thing. When you see a speed limit sign and you have an intention to respond to it, then when you're within some certain distance, you start modulating, or either letting up on the gas or bearing down on the gas to achieve that. The satisfaction conditions are fairly straightforward. And you terminate having one of these intentions whenever you see a new speed limit sign that says, here, drive some different speed. Right, so that intention stuff, the monitoring stuff added quite a bit. Now we have this green, sort of this green bullet down here, and also this green stuff up here. But there's still quite a bit to do. Just in terms of near-term stuff, there's going to be a pretty big integration between the new task network representation that we have and the kinds of intention stuff and monitoring stuff that you just saw, within, at least within the coming months. So we're gonna have a lot of challenges operationalizing stuff like motor intentions in an interesting way. Just in the interest of time, this is my last slide. The real stuff that's super interesting to us is the idea of executively controlled attention, or the agent controlling what it attends to, and having the agent have a role somehow, or believing at least it has a role in resisting these distractions. Of course, we're not saying anything about the agent being able to kind of exert contra-causal powers or weird magical powers to do this sort of control stuff, but it seems enough, at least, to have the agent believe that that's what's happened, and to be able to convince other people that that's what's happened. Maybe that's enough. I don't know. That's an interesting kind of empirical question, but it seems to be something really kind of worth doing, especially when you have these sorts of systems embedded in environments that are highly dynamic. It's trying to do 2 or 3 things at once, and there's real trade-offs to be made about how much attention is to be devoted to each one of those sorts of things over time. So I don't have an acknowledgement slide, but I did want to say thanks to Will Bridewell, to Andrew Lovett, and to Kevin O'Neill, all who contributed to some of the demos that you saw just now. So thanks very much, appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul. We don't really have time for questions right now. I think that's just like about 30 seconds left, but I know that Christian had one in the chat, so perhaps you guys can take that offline while Pat gets set up for his talk.